Uh, Thank you. I'd like to welcome you all here to this afternoon's Renewable City Dialogues. My name is Alex Boston. I'm the Executive Director of Renewable Cities. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territory of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam territory. We have a great speaker today, and this is a kind of an unexpected coincidence that we have this opportunity. Believe it or not, we were going to be having Catherine McKenna, Federal Minister of Environment, today, but that fell through because of some little challenges. But we will be having that event later on this spring or early next fall, and we won't be disappointed by any stretch of the imagination. As well as the people here, our dedicated public audience, I'd like to welcome those of you that are online. Our online is supported by PIX. And if you want to join in the conversation, hashtag RECities. You're welcome to make comments, pose questions, and we have somebody here that will pose those. Our other sponsors, longtime sponsors that allow us to do all our work is the Sitka Foundation and the North Growth Foundation. We greatly acknowledge their vision, along with SFU for being able to support programs like this that really foster a deeper understanding around important public policy issues. Our speaker today comes from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a really important entity. They have a better pulse on what's happening in the energy sector than a lot of government players around the world, including the International Energy Agency, being better able to predict trends, understand market dynamics and market change. And this is something we all need an appreciation of. And out there in our online audience, we actually have folks that are underneath the Peace Tower, trying to figure out our national zero emission vehicle strategy. And we have people on Capitol Hill, and there's citizens, and it really does matter. Citizens, city builders, you name it. We need a better grasp of what lights us up and what heats our homes and our offices and what moves us around our cities. And Ethan Zindler is the head of research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, based in DC. And the US office is really the heart of this analytical superpower. And we will have a much better grasp of particularly renewable electricity and energy supply, but also mobility issues at the end of this gathering. Ethan has a really storied career, literal and figurative. He has been writing at the White House and down to Wall Street, and that happened before he landed at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So we're super lucky to have Ethan. Thanks a lot. What we'll be doing is having about a 15-minute presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments, and we'll try and wrap up by about 2:30.
Terrific. Well, first, thank you, Alex. I really appreciate that introduction, and thanks everyone for hosting me here today. It's a real honor to be pinch hitting for your minister. I really appreciate that. This is not bad. The fact that I'm even vaguely acceptable as an alternative, I appreciate. So I'm going to, as was mentioned, I work with Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, BNEF, is a division of Bloomberg that focuses on the energy markets and really specifically on new energy technologies. We were started about 13, 14 years ago in London as a research firm called New Energy Finance, and we were just focused on renewables. After about 5 years, we were bought by Bloomberg, and now, of course, we're called Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And we've expanded our coverage to include a lot of other new energy technologies, electric vehicles. We look a lot more at gas these days, energy efficiency, and other things as well. But essentially, we write microeconomic research about the sector. We come at it very much from the perspective as business analysts. We felt when we started the firm that there was nobody counting all the wind turbines that were being built and how much they cost and where they were getting built, and what the levelized costs of energy were associated with that. So that's really what we've focused on since day one, not viewing this as a sort of charity case, but purely as an industry. And I think it's an industry that's reached a really interesting inflection point where it is increasingly cost competitive without the benefit of subsidies, which is really an exciting time. So with that as a precursor, just quickly, I'll zoom through the slides about us. There's about 200 of us around the world. This is where we're based. These are some of our clients. We have a mix these days of utilities and oil companies and others who are involved very much in the energy space, as well as major investors, automakers, and others. Some of our earliest clients were on the finance side, those who were looking to make money or avoid losing money on the energy transition. And finally, of course, a lot of government agencies. I'm based in Washington, as was mentioned, where the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Department of Defense, the State Department, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and a few others are all clients, because increasingly we find that the smartest policymakers actually think about clean energy similar to investors, which is that they want to make wise investments and wise policies that make the most and best use of taxpayer dollars. All right, so I'm going to talk about really 6 themes, and I'll move fairly quickly, and Alex, if I'm not moving quickly enough, kick me under the table. Luckily, you can do that with people not seeing. The first is going to be talking about the size of the market. The second, I'm going to talk about the nature of financing in this sector and how it's changed. Third, I'll talk about consumers. Fourth, I'll talk about batteries. This is, I think, a pretty educated crowd, so I say that batteries are getting sexier. I don't have to say that they're sexy. You probably all know that already. Then I'm going to talk about how the change is, in our view, inevitable at this point. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a little context about why, despite all the very positive things I'm going to talk about in terms of the economics of clean energy, why the current path we're on is not sufficient to address climate change. So first, just at the highest level, like I said, one of the things that we do is count the dollars of investment into clean energy technologies. And basically about 1/3 of $1 trillion goes into this sector every year. And when I say this sector, and when I say clean energy for this purpose, I'm defining it rather narrowly. It's really renewables I'm talking about. It's energy storage in the form of batteries. It's biofuels. It's what we call energy smart technologies, things like smart meters and other enabling energy efficiency devices. But what I'm not counting, I'm not even counting large hydro here. I'm not counting nuclear. I'm not counting natural gas here. So it's a fairly narrow definition. And even with that narrow definition, we're talking about again, about 1/3 of $1 trillion of new capital now coming into this industry just about every year. That number's been pretty flat. The good news, though, is that the rate at which build has been taking place, has been rising. And so we reached about 160 gigawatts of mostly wind and solar, but some other clean energy technologies last year. And the reason for that is because costs have been dropping. There are a lot of different examples of that, but one clear one, which you can see on your left, is just the cost of residential photovoltaics, or PV, down 60, 80, whatever percent, depending on the market. That red line you see at the bottom is the cost of an actual solar module from China, and I do highlight that it's from China because that's where the majority of the production takes place these days. That's the underlying cost of the equipment. Then there's the rest of the costs associated with putting something up on a roof, and you can see that actually markets differ. Some are more expensive than others. But frankly, all of them have seen costs come down. The question is when they'll all essentially converge, because there's no real reason why it should be $1 a watt more expensive to do a solar project in the US than it is in Australia. And this is the size of the build that we've seen. I'll talk a little bit more about money for just a second, because it's really important. The economics of clean energy are, in some ways, incredibly simple. If you think about it, if you built a new natural gas plant or some other project, there's a couple factors. The cost of building the plant, there's the cost of the money to build that plant, and then there's the potential cost of the gas or the coal or whatever it is you're going to fuel that with for the next 20 years. The good news about renewables is it's actually simpler. It's the cost of the equipment, and then it's the cost of the money to finance it. And that's really it, because you don't pay for the wind or the sun, and the maintenance of the project is almost, you could round it to almost nothing. So the real question on the economics on any project is how cheap can you buy your equipment and how cheap can you finance it? It's like buying your house, more or less. I mean, the financing is critical, and it makes a major difference over time. I would dwell on this point only to say that, you know, the numbers I showed were big, you know, $333 billion. About $250 billion every year goes into building stuff. That's projects, big things, and even residential systems. But the way that gets financed right now actually is pretty rudimentary. In other words, it's not that different fundamentally than how you might finance your home, in the sense that basically you want to build a wind farm, you go to a bank or a syndicate of banks, they lend you the money, you build the project. That's not how like the grown-up energy industry finances stuff. If you want to build a pipeline across Canada, you finance it with a bond, and you raise multiple billions of dollars at a time to do it. So one of the important things that we try and look at and try and understand is how much sort of we call green bond activity is going on. And the good news for the industry is that we've seen about $160 billion of green bonds that were issued last year and sold. Now, not all of those are clean energy project bonds. There's a lot of other things. There's, in fact, a lot of municipal stuff that goes on. And the mix of where that's taken place has been very global. We've also seen U.S. municipal green bonds related to transportation that have been issued. And I thought I'd show this number. It's a much smaller number, obviously, than the $160 billion that we showed last year. But that activity has been ticking up, and it is being used for a variety of purposes to fund bus fleets and other things like that at the municipal level. The empowered consumer, what am I talking about? Basically, one of the things that we think is really exciting about all this change that's gone on with these technologies is not just that it's lower carbon, but that consumers, thanks to technology and other things, are being given more control about how they use energy. How they even think about energy, I would argue, is changing in some cases. So if you think 20 or 30 years ago, you wanted to buy a car, you would buy a gasoline-powered car, or maybe you'd buy a diesel-powered car. Today, if you think about the choices you could have gasoline, you might still want to buy a diesel despite the emissions issues. You might want to buy a hybrid. You might want to have a fully electric vehicle. You might want to have a car that uses biofuels. Similarly, on the residential side, it used to be you just took the power that your utility sold you, and that was basically it. Now, you know, you have green tariff programs in some deregulated markets. You can pick from multiple utilities. You can put a PV system up on your roof. You could put a battery behind that PV system if you want. There are a lot more choices out there for consumers these days, which is making things really interesting and exciting. The only thing that I would caveat that with is that consumers only get motivated to care about this stuff if energy is expensive. So if you've got really cheap electricity, frankly, you'll just keep buying it and you're not going to worry about it that much. And that's actually the case for me, where I live in Virginia. Probably the case for a number of you here, where you have a large amount of hydro and power is cheap. So you need to find other ways to motivate consumers in some ways. But in a lot of other parts of the world, the motivation is there because it's expensive to buy energy. So when you just look at sort of people taking control of their energy lives, on the left-hand side, this is just the scope of residential PV penetration that we're starting to see. Australia is kind of amazing. About 1 in 5 roofs now in Australia has photovoltaics these days. And if you look further out, these are just our projections based on what we see as the uptick. You know, you see markets where you'll get up to perhaps about 50% of the market being essentially decentralized, meaning that some percentage of their power no longer comes from a central grid. This is part of what is going to take place going on. And basically, it creates, let me jump ahead for 1 second, it creates the need for a lot more technological innovation. And we're starting to see some of that. You know, the sort of digital revolution, the ability within businesses to understand their supply chain down to like every last tube of toothpaste that's moved from point A to point B. A lot of that kind of inventory management has just started in the energy industry, and there's a lot more thinking around how do you digitalize and all the different types of systems that you think about. I'm having a little trouble seeing these on my own screen, but basically you can see that batteries are really one of the key parts of all this because they play a role. But there's also, you know, home energy management systems and other types of systems that are critical to how all of this works. One other thing before I move off of, this is actually, I should say ride hailing, sorry about that. But before I move off this topic, and we will talk a lot more about transportation in just a second, is that obviously for consumers, what I didn't touch on is not only do you have the ability to pick what kind of car you want and how you want to power it, but there's a lot of people who might also now pick not to have a car. Particularly younger people seem to have relatively low interest in car ownership these days. And frankly, why should they when you can Uber or Lyft or whatever it is to get around? So this just looks at the amount of money that we've seen already raised by these companies. I would note that it dwarfs the amount that's been raised for transportation, green bonds, and things like that. There's a lot more private capital that's going into this area. And that also that, we have maybe, 500 million people who've now participated in some kind of ride hailing or sharing program. I'm going to move quickly just to say that, one thing, we've done a study for Masdar, a white paper that we put out in January. We tried to think through sort of illustratively the types of technologies that need to come along to sort of enable all of these cool things to come to be. And we're really on step one right now in terms of the ride hailing. But there are a lot of other things that are going to come along, some of which we think are inevitable and some of which are not so much. And I think, one of the things that we feel very comfortable about, and we'll talk about in a second, is that electric vehicles will become cost competitive pretty soon. But then there's autonomous vehicles, there's the Internet of Things, there's having smarter cities that communicate and understand information much better. These are all things that are sort of left to be determined, and I think are very much in the realm of actually policymakers to make happen to some large degree, because if you want to build a smarter city that makes better use of all of these types of things, I think there's a real opportunity there. I think, just to take the clearest, most immediate example, which is, ride hailing and Lyft and Uber and all these things. It's wonderful how this is starting to change people's lives, but there are real implications for emissions and there are real implications for congestion in cities. And I think it's something that policymakers, frankly, I think it's gotten ahead of policymakers to some large degree so far. So more on batteries. Batteries can be used for any variety of purposes and are really critical for sort of greasing the skids for all of this transition to continue on. Stating the very, very obvious, as you bring more renewables on, there is greater variability and greater intermittency. You don't have sun, you don't generally have much solar power, you don't have wind, you don't have a lot of wind power. So how do you smooth things out? And batteries can play a role really in the sort of seconds to minutes area of a power sector, of really meeting sort of short-term blips where power jumps. It can also provide power in sort of days to minutes ahead range, and then finally on the years to months ahead range. There are all kinds of applications. So one of the more exciting things, I guess I'll talk about vehicles for just a second. And I'll talk about our view on where batteries are going, but obviously one of the more exciting things around batteries has to do with electric vehicles. When you turned the clock 10 years ago, the number of choices you had was very, very limited. And now increasingly, just purely for illustrative purposes, you can see that the number of opportunities for consumers has risen enormously. Now, some of this is because the automakers are excited about this opportunity, and frankly, I think in some cases it's a combination of them being excited and feeling regulated. In particular, the moves by Audi and VW in the wake of the emissions scandal, I think it's not coincidental that they are plowing billions of dollars into EV technology now. They have emission standards they need to meet, and they won't meet them now with the vehicles that they have on the road. So it's policy driven for sure, but there's an opportunity there as well. So there's more and more coming. One qualitative point I'll make, many of you may have driven or own or lease an electric vehicle. I would say one point I always try to make is that on a basic qualitative basis, an electric vehicle, I would argue, is a superior product to an internal combustion engine vehicle in almost every way except for range. And even the range issue is being addressed. But the cars are quieter, they accelerate faster, and they require a lot less maintenance. So, the question is, when will consumers come to this realization? So thinking about consumers. First of all, on batteries, the good news is that the price of batteries has been dropping very sharply. And we track this very closely. We survey buyers and sellers. We estimate that the price of a battery these days for a typical lithium-ion battery power pack is somewhere around $230 per kilowatt hour, down from as high as about $800 a kilowatt hour, really quite recently, about 2010. You've seen an enormous decline. Our view is that we think the prices continue. They don't go down as sharply. The recent drops have been driven by overcapacity, but now we're going to be on a path that's more driven by technology. But there will be a point at which EVs become a decision that consumers make based purely on cost without subsidies. And now, let's be clear, we're not there right now. In the US, for instance, it's $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicles. I don't actually know what it is here in Canada. I think it differs by province, but zero. I'm seeing James telling me it's zero. No federal support. But the point is that if you don't have support, people don't buy them right now, generally speaking, unless, of course, you want to buy them because you have a sort of you're not, so let's say, economically sensitive, and you think Teslas are cool, or B, you have a certain sort of green tint to you, and that probably is where I fall in. I drive a Nissan Leaf, which is the energy analyst's version of a Tesla. But our long-term view about EVs is that they start to take over the world in the next 20 years, basically. That about half the cars that will get sold will be EVs by 2040, and about a third of the cars on the road by then will be. It'll lag the time to cycle out the cars that are out there, but it's an inevitability as these prices continue to drop. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to dwell on I'm going to move through a couple quick things and just say that when we put that forecast out a few years ago, frankly, people started to accuse us of being crazy. But it's amazing to me how quickly the sort of conventional wisdom around electric vehicles is shifting. And I think that does matter, frankly, because it does, you need to gain some sort of social acceptance if you want to actually make this happen. So this is the Economist cover showing the internal combustion engine from last summer. This is just a headline from the other day. BP is now saying that they think that they see oil demand starting to level off, in part because of EVs. The CEO of Shell says he's going to drive an EV. The CFO apparently already does. And so that's sort of an inevitable thing that we're seeing going on. I'm going to blow through these quick just to say that from the US perspective, the force of change that we've seen in terms of decarbonization has been very substantial. And frankly, I think Canada's on a slightly different path. You have so much hydro and zero carbon generation up here that it isn't necessary. There's certainly room for improvement, but it's not the same as the US, where we went from half our power coming from coal 10 years ago to 30% last year, with most of the additions being natural gas and renewables. And that kind of transition is so far underway that, frankly, it doesn't matter the fact that back where I'm based in Washington, the current administration has basically rescinded the Clean Power Plan, which was the federal effort to reduce emissions. And the reason I say it doesn't matter is because the US will probably hit those long-term 2030 CO2 emissions goals on the power sector within the next 2 or 3 years. Anyway, we don't need the regulation to get there. On the transportation side is a different story, and there is a looming fight between Washington and California. In fact, even a new development on that today over the question of what our automobile standards are going to be, and I understand that has implications for Canada because yours are synced up to ours. All right, I'm going to finish real quick and just say that on the long-term view, we do believe that the kind of cost curves that we've seen, the declines continue, the change is inevitable and happens. And as we see countries like India and China and others develop, that they will bring more of this stuff in because it is the lowest cost option in a lot of cases. And what that means is that we probably will see about a doubling, excuse me, in the total amount of capacity that we have online from now to 2040. With renewables and with wind and solar eventually accounting for about half of our capacity. One thing I would note, though, is we don't expect that the total amount of electricity that people consume will double. And that's because basically there's been a lot of improvements of efficiency, particularly in OECD countries. And so when I showed this doubling of capacity, what I'm really saying is it will add a lot of capacity that will run at lower capacity factors. So a solar project might generate about 20%. A really good wind project, you're lucky if you're up over 50, but most are more like in the 30s or 40% of the time are they actually generating power. So we have a lot more capacity operating at different hours, and that's where you need all this technology and batteries and other things. And then on my last slide, I would just say that that this picture that I paint for you is more optimistic than you'll see from the International Energy Agency, more optimistic than certainly you'll see from the Energy Information Agency administration in Washington, more optimistic than ExxonMobil, others. And yet, it's still really not sufficient. If you look at the amount of global power sector CO2 emissions, we project under that quite positive scenario that CO2 emissions will basically be more or less flat over the next 20 years, but that will not cut it if the power sector is going to make its contributions to the world at large. And the gap between the amount that we project to be invested and the amount that we think needs to be invested is about another $5 trillion, which sounds like a lot of money, but just to be clear, every 3 years, we're putting $1 trillion into clean energy right now. So it's actually over 20 years' time. It's not that absurd a figure. So there's a lot of exciting things that have happened. There's a lot more work to be done. And with that, I will hand the mic back.
Thank you, Ethan. I think that was a really important point. Be optimistic and realistic, but recognize it's not sufficient. So if you're asking a question or making a comment, please wait for the microphone so that our online audience is able to take advantage of your insights, and just introduce yourself and also your name. And so we'll start up here and then we'll go to here.
Hi, my name is Tom.
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. My name is Thomas Juni. I do some consulting related to biomass energy and community energy management. My question relates to externalities. There are a lot of external costs associated with using internal combustion engine vehicles and coal power plants. How would the net economics change if those externalities were included? Would there be a net total social cost savings if we were to shift to renewables more aggressively than you envisioned?
It's a good, so the question is whether there would be a net savings. The short answer is we haven't done that, the netting out. I think I think about it on a micro level, certainly, there's some of this is going to be very disruptive. I think about the U.S. example, and the number of coal plants that have closed in the United States and the effects on the coal industry. There have been a lot of people who've lost their jobs, so I don't think it's ever worth sort of soft pedaling the fact that disruption can be hard for a lot of folks. On the other hand, we have several million folks working in the clean energy sector in the U.S., jobs that didn't exist 10 years ago, solar installers and others. But I don't have a net number for you. I think if we did the math, we would certainly view it as a net positive because the inevitable costs associated with climate change are enormous. And if you can do something to stave them off, I think that has a net benefit to society. But to be clear, what I'm not saying is that we are going to avoid climate change with any of this.
I think, Tom, that's a really important point that you've raised. And one of the things that provinces, states, federal governments around the world aren't doing very well is really good multi-criteria analysis to better understand what the net gains and the losses are, to give us a clearer picture of where we're going. And we have to incorporate those to optimize our direction. We have a question right here, James.
Thanks. James Glaive. Ethan, I'm just curious, you mentioned at the end that there was what you said was a $5 trillion gap to, I assume, stay on a 2 degrees or reach a 2 degrees pathway. Where is that money going to come from? And can you put that in context a little bit for us? What is 5 trillion?
Well, actually 5 trillion, so the 160 billion in green bonds is a drop in the bucket for I can't remember how many trillions we issue every year in bonds. The bond market is absolutely enormous. It's multi-trillion. I can't remember the number of trillions. So there's a lot of capital out there looking for a home, and we've certainly seen that people are willing to invest more in these types of projects because they now regard them as relatively low risk so long as they're in low risk countries. But the short answer to your question is that basically a lot of it has to come from the private sector, but the private sector won't put the money up if they don't see an opportunity. And look, in markets where demand for energy is growing very rapidly, capital will go in and fund it. The challenge in some cases, in many ways, is in OECD countries where we have power systems and other systems that are well established and they won't turn over automatically because they're not growing. So demand for electricity, for instance, in the US has basically been flat for 5 years. I don't think it's growing in Canada either. And so there you need a push to swap stuff out, especially stuff that's not inefficient. Some of it happens automatically. You know, you have old coal plants like we do in the US, they get shut. But in other places, you need more of a policy push to get there. And you know, our view is we don't think that the policies that are out there at the moment do it.
Question here, here, and I put myself on the speakers list.
Great, thank you very much for your presentation. My name's Ramona Materi, and I'm the author of a book called Starting a Green Business in Canada. But my question for you is on Australia, and you showed a very 20% of the installed PV and that type of thing. Could you elaborate on that? Like what is going on in Australia? Is it unique to Australia, or could other countries learn from what's going on there?
It's a really good question. I think certainly people can learn from the Australian experience. I think there are some unique aspects. They have great solar resource there in many parts of the country, and a lot of standalone houses that are sort of ready-made for solar with good roofs. But there has also been policy support in the forms of, I believe, feed-in tariffs, if I recall, that got the market started. I also think, though, Australia is interesting in that it's, you know, one of the things that we try and think about is, you know, we look at this very much from an economic perspective, that we think consumers will make these decisions based on the moment, you know, a PV system makes the most sense. They kind of pencil out the net present value of it, blah, blah, blah. They do it. They figure out how much they can borrow the money for. There's also another aspect, which is like, you know, at some point you see enough of your neighbors that they have these systems and you think, okay, that's cool, and I want that also. And I think that Australia is starting to get towards that point. And that's something that I think other markets can try and emulate at some point, but we need to reach some kind of scale. But it's very impressive what they've done down there and where they think they're going. They're also experimenting with some other interesting things, like having a virtual power plant, where the South Australia government is going to have 1,000 Tesla power walls distributed to its consumers. And essentially, collectively, those consumers will serve as power plants, meaning that those batteries can be discharged on a whim at the order of the utility to meet certain types of power demand at certain hours. So it's an interesting test lab for things that are going on.
Good question here.
Thank you. My name's Graham Anderson. I just completed a 10-month research project on the future of personal mobility in Canada and some of the policy implications, specifically looking long-term. So I appreciate your comments on those connections. I'm curious, how much do you think the corporate average fleet economy standards have been a necessary part of the evolution and increased uptake of electric vehicles throughout North America? And where do you see the best path forward with the current situation with the EPA essentially rolling back those standards? And specifically, I'm curious if you see a more optimistic scenario there where the number of states and perhaps Canada joins in the jurisdictions that uphold those standards to the point that essentially automakers have to retain the higher standard. So what is the threshold? How much of that cooperation among those jurisdictions would we need to see?
A really good question. So, I mean, first basic point, which is the U.S. is making enormous progress on reducing our CO2 emissions from the power sector, but we will never get to the Paris target of overall CO2 reductions if we don't cut our emissions from the transportation sector. and we'll never get there if we don't have CAFE standards. So to your first question, which is how important have CAFE been in sort of in the transition and the change that we've seen in the auto sector, they've been enormously important. And for a while there, as you probably know, the average efficiency of vehicles on the road in North America was rising quite nicely, and it has actually leveled off in the last couple of years as gasoline prices have come back down. So if you don't continue to mandate it, at least in my view, you don't continue to have it rise. I also would sort of editorialize and say that one of the reasons they were able to put in place such good standards back in 2010 or so, I think a little earlier, you know better than I do, was part of it was in the wake of the financial crisis and the fact that the government had bailed out the automakers, and the automakers had very little leverage to complain about it. And now we are at a different time, obviously, with the Trump administration, and one of the key questions that's coming up is regarding what happens to the CAFE standards. As you know, and probably maybe some others do, basically in the United States, California has a waiver to set its own emission standards, and that's long-standing. And California's joined, I think, by about another 15 states that represent a majority of car drivers in the United States. So de facto, California has been setting our national automobile standards. Now along comes the Trump administration, and they are saying, wait a second, we don't think that's right. And in fact, just I think literally this morning or yesterday on Bloomberg, Administrator Pruitt basically sounded the alarm and said, look, we're going to fight California on this. Mary Nichols the other day said, we're going to fight you on it. And so if basically the federal government in the US says we want to override that waiver, what will inevitably happen is the mother of all lawsuits between California and Washington. And at least in my view, it'll take a while to play that out. And I think one of the questions, and this came up in a meeting I was in earlier, is what about Canada? How does Canada then fit into all of that? And since your standards, as I understand, are synced up to ours, the question I guess the question I have is, how would how does your law regard what will be legal wrangling under our law? Because I suspect that this case between California and the EPA, if it takes place, will go on for some time. There's been some talk of a negotiated settlement where basically the standards would be adjusted in some way that was acceptable to California, but that agreement's not been reached. And so, look, for all the talk and the bluster about the Trump administration and their impact on Paris and the Clean Power Plan, I actually think, and I wrote this the other day, most of what they've done so far has not really had any meaningful impact on the sort of clean energy evolution that's underway. But this one really matters. And so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
So we have a question in the middle, but I'm going to hitchhike on that mobile question and explore one of the sort of least mature elements of market transformation, which you showed, like way out here off to the early 2030s is the electric bus, right? And we have jurisdictions like Norway, which have the greatest penetration of electric vehicles anywhere in the world, 30% pretty much. And it's heralded as a great success. But they've had 2 decades of growing use of public transit, growing share of cycling, growing share of walking, and all of those indicators have turned. They have now growing car ownership per household and reversing a 20-year trend. And is this the kind of city that we want, congestion clogged? From a Canadian perspective, and a proud supporter of our Olympic team, I want them to be wedded to their automobile and become more obese and be more physically inactive and not get to the top of the podium. But I am concerned that there hasn't been enough leadership by national governments, by subnational governments, by transit authorities to send messages to the manufacturing sector that for short-haul freight and for electric buses, we need a massive procurement agenda continentally with our somewhat integrated market and globally in order to bring back or just accelerate that market transformation process. So if you could comment on that, that would be great.
Well, great point, and a lot of different things that sort of unpack in that. But I mean, I would say is that Well, first, as we think about electric vehicles and that our projection, we're pretty rudimentary in how we think about when the sort of inflection point is when consumers will buy them. We say, when will the sticker price without subsidies basically be the same? But more sophisticated buyers of transportation equipment do a lifetime calculation on the total cost of owning the vehicle based on how much it costs to put either diesel fuel in it or electricity. So the first and most logical potential adopters and the people to take advantage of these declining costs in batteries are those who operate substantial fleets of vehicles. I met yesterday actually with the folks here from the city of Vancouver, and they were telling me about how they're starting to convert some of their fleets of city-owned buses and actually of vans and other trucks to electrics and look more into that. So I think that's one area, and I think we'll see more and more, and that makes the most sense. I would note that China has already gone ahead in Shenzhen. I think my understanding is that it's a 16,000 bus fleet that they're converting to all electric, which is like basically, as I understand it, the size of the bus fleet of Chicago, LA, and New York combined. So they're doing it, and they're starting to do it. Not so coincidentally, there's a company called BYD, which happens to be based in Shenzhen. It's going to build all those buses for them. So, there are examples around the world where this is starting to happen, but your point's very well taken, which is that, municipalities and others that have the sophistication to make these calculations, and in theory can raise the money, the upfront money in the form of a bond or whatever to buy those buses, should take the lead on this stuff.
Question right here.
Great, thanks. My name is Penelope Comet from the Pembina Institute. I have a question relating to the same slide that Alex was asking about. And I was interested in your enabling technologies. You listed AI and blockchain. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, because I can't quite make the connection between those sort of big steps and the electrification of transportation.
So actually, and good question, and I kind of blew through that slide. And I would invite you to check out the paper that my colleagues wrote on this, because there's a certain exercise in imagination that goes on around it, I would say. But I will say this, which is that our general view about that if you end up in a world, take Australia for example, or others, where you start to have a lot more of your power being generated on a dispersed basis, then you need a lot of new technologies that allow the control and the understanding and the trading of energy and the value of energy at a more localized kind of basis. And so that's sort of the thinking there around that. But it is an idea that I'm happy to share the paper with you that gets fleshed out a little bit more in detail there than I'm doing it justice.
You have a question right here. And there's a lot of hands shooting up, and if I've acknowledged you by eye, you're on my list. But we won't get through all of them likely, but we'll do our best.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Erica. I have, in terms of regulation, like the central authority, for example, Canada, BC, it's BC Hydro, and in China, it's the China Grid. How would you say if private sector have like a good invention on the renewable energy product, will took the profit down with the central authority, how they can have the bargaining between each other? Yeah,
just to make sure that the online audience, and correct me if I'm mistaken, we have large electric utilities that are regulated by subnational and national governments in different parts of the world. How do they adjust nimbly to innovations in energy supply and efficiency as well, I guess?
Was that the question, or was it also about whether or not private sector players could make money within that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. No, that was good. I think between us we got it. Look, the answer is yes. I mean, there's certainly within the context of Canada, there have been plenty of private developers that have been building projects, and as well in China as well, domestic players more often. But you're right in the sense that the edict, and certainly within China, has come down to build these increasing. I mean, the volumes of what's been built of renewables in China is is unbelievable. They built like 50 gigawatts of solar in China last year. That's like, in the US, our all-time high, I think, was about 13 gigawatts. So it's just massive amount of build-out. So there are a number of startup and various smaller players involved. There's certainly a bunch of utilities as well. It's not just State Grid, though. There are a lot of other players that have been. I think the question of whether or not those players are going to be able to make money, though, is whether, in China, the China context, is whether or not they get dispatched. So there's been a lot of capacity that's been built, and not all of it actually is generating and selling into the grid, because on, not so infrequently, what's being prioritized are existing coal plants that are further down the transmission line. And so the capacity numbers, unfortunately, don't match what the generation should be in China, and thus that, I'm sure, will affect the economics of those who built those projects.
So what we'll do, just to ensure that we can at least hear the questions, we still have 13 minutes or so. The three gentlemen here, if you're able to each ask your question, state your name, ask your question briefly, and then Ethan will respond to all three of them.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask two really quick questions. James from the Vancouver Economic Commission. First one, totally agree with you about electric cars being a superior product. Everyone should test drive a Tesla if you don't believe me. Aren't they almost getting cost competitive now? I think I saw yesterday from your newsletter, it costs $5 to fill up an electric vehicle now versus $50 for my Toyota Corolla. So I haven't factored, I should run the number myself, but I think it might even be perhaps quicker because it's not obviously just the battery, but factoring the cost of fueling. And the second one is carbon extraction technologies. Are you seeing any investment? Is there any hope on that front? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Pete. I'm from Fraser Basin Council. You said batteries are sexier. I agree with that, but things get scarier when it maybe in next 10 to 12 years when they all reach end of life, and what is your view on recycling? Because why I'm asking this question is actually I'm involved in life cycle analysis of batteries, particularly to BC, and I don't think there is a way where it actually reaches the circular economy of the batteries. Thank you.
Great. And then one more question right in front, thanks.
As the prices of renewables decreases till you reach grid parity, or close, even not quite grid parity, how much is the decline of coal as a result of the fact that it's not really compatible with the renewable energy that are online because of the dispatchability of renewable energy compared to coal?
Do you have all those?
I think so.
Okay. There's 4 of them snuck in.
One question. Okay. Okay, so first, are we at the crossover point for, and I used to be a reporter, so that's why we'll see if I can still have the knack for doing this. But are we at a crossover point for EVs now? The answer is yeah, in some markets, for sure. I mean, especially, if you live some places where gasoline is particularly expensive, there's no question about it. I would say that when I use crossover, we do it in the most conservative way, which is to say the point at which consumers see sticker prices unsubsidized. But you're right, you can do the math now. I mean, I have an EV, we've had one for 4 years, and I think that it's generally, it seems to have penciled out pretty nicely, even with gasoline prices having come down in the US. I live in Northern Virginia where electricity is real cheap, and so that certainly helped us on the math. So the answer is yes in some contexts. I think you asked about carbon extraction technology. I assume you mean by carbon sequestration technologies?
No, I mean taking out the upper scarlet.
Okay.
Turn it into a fuel. It's very
carbon
early
engineering.
stage. I'm just seeing if you're tracking any investment globally, because we clearly need to be extracting out the carbon, not just reducing how much we're producing.
So we do track. The investment in those technologies. I don't know what the number is off the top of my head, but look, that would be a venture capital investment. VC investment is typically now these days, sadly, somewhere in the $3 to $5 billion range versus a total I showed about $330 billion. So that kind of early stage capital is real small. I'm aware of a couple of the companies out there. I can't frankly remember their names. It's great that someone's trying to do it. And but from an economic perspective, if you don't have a carbon price to sort of motivate that, it doesn't. You aren't going to see real flows of capital. And I don't know enough about the technology to know if it's possible at all. End of life for batteries is another great one. frankly, there'll need to be some kind of a solution to this if that world comes to be that I'm talking about, where half the cars that get sold are EVs by 2040. I know right now that in some cases when you turn back in your leased electric vehicle, which is what I did with my Leaf after the first 3 years, that apparently they can take the battery out and then they can use it for behind the meter purposes. So you can get some extra life on it, but eventually you're right, you're stuck with a battery that has basically no value. And the question of how you dispose of them has not been solved. And I don't know the answer is to that yet. And then how much is coal's demise due to its lack of compatibility with renewables? It's a really interesting and good question. I'll speak for the market I know best about, which is the U.S. We have ancient coal plants. They're not cost competitive. The Sierra Club and others take a lot of credit for shutting them down. They've played a role in that. There's no question about it. But when you have an asset that's 30 or 40 years old, it doesn't it's not competitive. So newer plants may have better ability to ramp. But gas in particular is a much more compatible fuel, and we, by the way, happen to have in North America an enormous abundance of gas that's cheaper. So I think that is part of the story. It's not just maybe that coal isn't great for this, but it's also that there's other technologies that are much, much better, whether gas and now batteries as well, that interface better.
Before we go to another question, I'd just like to comment on the carbon sequestration economics question, and there's a really economically viable one, and that's to stop permanent deforestation. And the biggest driver outside the oil and gas industry in Canada is actually suburbanization, and it registers, and it's very powerful. And it's something that we have to do because it's registering on the provincial inventory and the national inventory in a really big way, and it's super cost effective to save those urban forests. Back here.
Hello, my name is Grant Duckworth. I just have one comment. I'm with the Canadian International Council, which is a nonpartisan think tank. I just want to let everyone know that if you're interested in talking about this issue again, we're holding an event on March 20th at UBC, and it's about private equity investment in the context of SDGs. So if you're interested, you can register on Eventbrite. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then Michael Alexander here at the front.
Thank you, Michael Alexander. In the Australia example where you're talking about solar on rooftops, you alluded to something that I call, although you didn't mention it, but something I call herd mentality, that you reach a point where if your neighbors are doing it, you're going to do it. At what point does that click in with electric vehicles, despite any cost differential, particularly given the fact that virtually everybody I know who's ever ridden an electric vehicle once has said, wait a minute, this is better?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In fact, I didn't show this, but we have another chart which I like, which kind of looks at from sort of year zero when a new technology is introduced to year whatever 20 when it over its life cycle, and we looked at like dishwashers and the VCR and different kind of new mobile phones, right? Things that came along, and you're exactly right that actually the adoption doesn't generally look like this. It kind of looks like this, and then it looks like that, right? There's a moment where everyone's like, boom, like this is something that I need. This will change my life. And I think EVs, you're exactly right, might be a better to fit that, maybe more analogous to that than photovoltaics. And the reason for that is because, look, PV, as great as it is essentially just a substitution for something we all know and love already, which is, consistent 24/7 power. We've already got that. This is a product that's potentially superior, and you're right, it has that potential to have a much quicker uptake. And and like I said, when we showed our forecast several years ago, people thought we were nuts. Now some people say, well, look, it could happen much, much faster. The only thing is, there's real questions around constraints about how fast, if that were to happen, if tomorrow suddenly demand were just to go through the roof, would there be enough EVs out there to actually satisfy demand? In the short run, the answer is no. You look at the struggles that Tesla's having to meet the numbers. They've got, I think, 400,000 or 500,000 orders for their Model 3. and they're struggling to get them built. And frankly, our EV forecast, short term for this year in North America is plus or minus 30,000 based on, frankly, whether Tesla can build the cars that they say they're going to build. So I think your point's very well taken, that it could happen faster, but we also are going to have bottlenecks along the way, and not just with the making of the cars, also with the availability of cobalt and lithium and the materials that go into making the batteries.
One more question here and then to the front.
Hi, so I'm Anitra Paris, and my question is about the way that you're looking, and you're talking about when you're seeing something without subsidies, the technologies in the future, and how much does a carbon tax play into this when you're forecasting those futures? If there's a stronger policy with carbon tax, which scenarios are you really looking at?
Good question. We do our forecast, our long-term forecast, which I encourage you to look up, or I can send you, is called the New Energy Outlook. And it's just on the power sector, basically, with some look at electric vehicles as well. And our standard attitude is we simply assume that whatever policies are on the books stay on the books, and if they're due to sunset, they sunset, but we make no presumptions about anything else. So for instance, for Canada, there has been a stated policy about a carbon price, and we did include that. But in most cases, we don't actually have a whole lot of we don't dream up the policies that we think should be in place. We figure if we kind of unvarnish it as much as possible, then hopefully people can kind of see that you do need more policy to do something.
And we have one more question from our communications manager.
So this is Kian of Renewable Cities. Thank you for the presentation, Ethan. I'm just wondering, what is your takeaway, your insight into the trend of it's more of a recent trend, but subnational governments coming together to really set the tone for the market. And I'm referring to the mass order of electric vehicles by groups of cities in the United States specifically. I think they came together to pledge 100,000 EVs over some period of time. I'm just curious, how that is factoring into trends in your thinking on the adoption.
Interesting question. So that is not, I would say, that number we haven't sort of factored in a direct way, but it's something we probably will start to have to. I mean, I will say this, most of our research to date has been on light-duty cars and consumer adoption of them, but there's so much more going on with commercial and municipal fleets and other things like that. And I think that's what you're talking about, or are these pledges these are pledges for fleet purchases.
Municipal fleets,
yeah,
yes.
And so that's not something we've done a lot of work on, but we will, and need to, because as I was saying before to the earlier question, those types of buyers are the most sophisticated and could be the ones that would make these calculations and buys sooner. And there are investments going on around the margins in companies to build those types of vehicles faster. And I think that some of the automakers kind of get that. And especially when you're talking about a new technology, you're always very happy if you can sell, if you can line up a contract to sell 5,000 of them at a time as opposed to having to sell them. And there is one additional challenge, which is that I don't think EVs, and one reason why automakers would probably rather go down that route is that I don't think EVs lend themselves very well for the existing distribution channel of auto dealers. Just pretty simply, like, at least in the US, I don't want to speak for Canada, but the dealers make their money off of servicing vehicles. So if the vehicles don't break down that much, they don't necessarily want to sell. They don't have let's just put it this, they don't have an inherent incentive to sell as many of them.
I think we've exhausted questions and we're right on time. So thank you for those savvy questions. And the savvy